we have some questions for you, and don't be afraid, we will not repeat the question at the end of the session like the session before, so to see if you changed your mind. But for that we have some more questions than the lessons before, the session before. The first question is, maybe, how much will our transportation system change in 2030, by 2030? Drastically, that's the first one. New means of transport will dominate. The second question answer would be, some things will change. New means of transportation will complement today's means of transport. Or answer 3, hardly anything will change. New means of transportation will remain the exception. So please switch on your device, 1, 2, or 3, the next 10 seconds, please. Okay, so the vast majority said some things will change. New means of transportation will complement today's means of transport. So you're not so much into science fiction, I guess. So it's maybe 2/3 of the audience is a little bit enthusiastic and a little bit skeptical. Okay, thank you very much for that. So the second question will be, this is a discussion that is actually in every newspaper, even in Handelsblatt. So will driverless cars on the Autobahn be the norm in 2030? So there are so many companies trying to find a solution for that. So the first answer would be most definitely. The second, probably not. And the third, no way. So please put the bottom 1, 2, or 3 within the next 10 seconds, please. Oh, most says no way. That's so more than into science fiction than I thought before. So more than half of the people think that there will be driverless cars on the Autobahn within the next 12 years. So hopefully I do not have to be frightened of that. So, okay, so, and no way, the skeptical ones are only 12%. That's not much, so good luck for that. Thank you very much. And the third question will be, will autonomous passenger drones, flying taxis be part of everyday life in 2030? Maybe some of you heard that there are some tests even in Dubai and the Emirates with these flying drones, without any pilots that fly from the airport into the city. And your answer would be first, most definitely. The second would be probably not. And the third one would be no way. So please press your button within 10 seconds, please. Probably not. So the majority is not very certain that there will fly drones from the airport into the city without any pilots. Maybe some of you are too frightened to think of that. So no way. It's 28%. So it's not very not many people believe that there will be drones within the next 12 years. So good news for the pilots, I think. And the fourth question is, will supersonic aircraft be part of everyday life in 2030? Maybe you heard of some tests or some projects with a company that's called Boom, and that Japan Airlines tried maybe to sponsor this test, like the Concorde that was thrown from the market, I think 15 or 18 years ago after a huge accident. But now they are trying to build a new supersonic aircraft. Do you think it will have a future? The first answer would be most definitely. The second, probably not. The third, no way. So please press button 1, 2, or 3 within the next 10 seconds. So a third of you is thinking that there will be a supersonic aircraft again flying. So be aware of this supersonic boom. It's a very loud one, so maybe you will hear it in 2030. But half of the people think there will be probably no supersonic jet, and 18% says no way. Thank you for your vote. And the last question for this first session is, thank you. Will aircraft or helicopters without pilots be part of everyday life in 2030? It's not about drones, but maybe about helicopters and normal aircrafts that are already able to fly without pilots, with an autopilot, but for security reasons it's not allowed at the moment. So do you think there will be some aircraft without pilots? Answer first, most definitely. 2, probably not. 3, no way. So please vote 1, 2, or 3. Thank you very much. So one fourth says most definitely. So nearly 25% is thinking that they will step into a plane without a pilot. So it's rather brave. Thank you very much. But the majority is very skeptical. So 45 probably not, no way. Nearly 30%. Maybe you're right. Maybe you're wrong. To answer your question or your thoughts, I would like to present you Joel Brandon-Bravo. Maybe he will have some answers to your questions. Thank you very much.
Is there a clicker? Good afternoon, everyone. Very interesting results. We'll see if the general population agree with you. So I'm very excited to be here. I love this topic about future travel, future technology. I'm going to assume you're all excited about it as well, because you've all come into this session, or at least interested. And what you've been hearing about is what a lot of people are terming the third revolution in travel. The first revolution was the steam engine. The second revolution was the internal combustion engine. But this third revolution, this is a revolution of renewable, of electric, of hyper, of supersonic, and even space. But the thing about revolutions is it's not a revolution if it doesn't bring the masses with it. And does anyone recognize this? Wave if you recognize it. A couple of Brits in the room. This was the Sinclair C5. It was the invention of Sir Clive Sinclair, who had successfully put home computers into millions of homes and thought that he could revolutionize the way people commute. This was 33 years ago. It was ahead of its time. It was a rechargeable electric vehicle. But the reason it failed is that Sir Clive Sinclair failed to do the customer research about whether people were going to be willing to sit in this and commute to work. Quite simply, they weren't. And this ended up on the technological scrap heap. So obviously there's a question, will the masses come along with these new technologies? And maybe to give it some perspective, we could look back at what people thought of the technologies that we take for granted today. Can anyone guess who said this? The horse is here to stay, but the automobile is a fad, it's a novelty. Does anyone know who said that? It was actually the president of a US bank advising Henry Ford's lawyer not to invest in the Ford Motor Company. It'll probably go down as the worst piece of financial advice of all time. And what about this quote? "How, sir, would you make a ship sail against the wind and the currents by lighting a fire on its deck?" Anybody know who that was? If I could have done a French accent, I would have done. It's Napoleon Bonaparte, when he heard about Robert Fulton's steamboat in 1830. And around the same time, an eminent doctor in 1830, over 30 years after trains had started rolling along the tracks, said, "Rail travel at high speed is not possible because passengers would be unable to breathe and would die of asphyxia." Well, fortunately, back then, as now, there are people like Dirk of the Hyperloops, Elon Musk, and Richard Branson who are continually trying to push the barriers forward in terms of travel. And we should just take a moment to ask, well, why is this important? According to IATA, there will be 4 billion trips on aircraft this year. That has doubled since 2006. And actually, according to that IATA forecast, it will double again to 8 billion passengers by 2036. So the skies are filling up. And it's not just the skies that are getting full. The roads as well. There are already 1 billion cars on today's roads. And that's forecast to reach 2.5 billion. That's a 150% increase. And if you take the city of Beijing, they are adding 1,500 new cars to the roads every single day. So clearly there's an infrastructure issue, there's a congestion issue, but more importantly, there's an environmental issue as well. Nearly a quarter of the world's CO2 emissions come from transportation. And the airline industry alone is burning 5 million barrels of oil every day. And that's before all of that growth that I just talked about. So what are we doing about it? What are these new forms of transport that are coming on stream? The one you're probably most familiar with is the driverless car. A lot of it in the press. In fact, only 2 weeks ago, it was in the press that the state of California has changed the law so it is no longer a requirement to have an actual driver sitting there at the wheel in order to take over control in the case of emergency. So it's changes in the laws like that that are going to see this type of driverless car rolled out much more rapidly. You heard Christoph just mention this. Pilotless drones. This one's called a volocopter. And as Christoph mentioned, actually, the Crown Prince of Dubai got on board himself and flew 200 meters above the ground for 5 minutes. So he had faith in it, and they think this will be in service within 5 years in Dubai. And of course, the Hyperloops. For those of you in the last session, it was fascinating to hear from Dirk about this piece of technology. They're claiming that they will carry 164,000 passengers, and it will reduce the time of travel from Cologne to Munich to just 40 minutes instead of over 4 hours that you currently would sit on a train. In addition to those three, you've got super fast trains. The Chinese are already testing 600 to 800 km/h trains, and they believe, or they're claiming, that they will get trains up to 2,500 km/h. I actually caught up with Dirk briefly after his talk, and he says there are huge challenges once you go beyond the speed of sound. It's about 1,200 km/h. So that 2,500 km/h would be twice the speed of Concorde. Christoph also mentioned this, another Branson-backed project, the Boom supersonic aircraft. I know the question was whether these will be in place by 2030. Actually, they're claiming that this will go into first service in 2025, just 7 years away, and will reduce the flight time from London to New York to just 3 hours. And finally, Uber, in talks with NASA about the regulation in the skies, claiming that they will be first testing Uber Elevate, the flying car, by 2020. Ambitious. I think you'll agree. So those are the new forms of transport that are going to be coming on stream. But the question is, will the masses adopt them? Will they engage with these forms of transport? Or will they end up like the Sinclair C5? Well, the reality is that it's here already in many ways. Many of you here at ITB Berlin, I imagine, also go to London's World Travel Market. Does everyone go to that? A few nods. You might have got out to the Excel Conference Centre on the DLR, the District Light Railway. What you probably didn't realise is that is actually a driverless train, and has been for many years. Or, if you've been through Heathrow and Frankfurt Airport, you may have got a driverless pod between the terminals. So to that question then, the important question, are the masses going to adopt these forms of transport? Well, to try and answer that question, and I'm talking about the results exclusively today, we surveyed over 6,000 travellers across Europe and North America to get their sentiment towards these new forms of travel. Are they excited about them? Do they trust them? What do they think the benefits will be? Will they accept them? So the first thing that we asked is, which of these new types of transport are you most excited about? Dirk will be very happy that the one that came out on top was actually the Hyperloop. 48% people identified that as the one that they were most excited about. Back to the Future fans, maybe, or Blade Runner fans, also excited about the prospect of driving a flying car. Actually echoing some of the caution that you all showed when you were answering those questions, there's much less enthusiasm about getting into a pilotless flying vehicle or drone. And actually, a surprising one was that people were really excited about the idea of teleporting. I mean, I can understand why you'd want to be able to get from home to a beach on the other side of the planet instantly, but I myself find the concept of being atomized into a billion pieces and then reconstituted on the other side of the planet somewhat scary. But what's interesting when you dig in the data is actually the difference between different generations and different age groups. While overall there's definitely skepticism about pilotless drones, the younger generation are more than twice as accepting of pilotless drones than the older generation. And more than twice as excited about teleportation, despite being far too young to have even watched Star Trek. But there is realism. There's realism about when they expect these technologies to come. So the least likely to be here, according to our survey results, by 2030 was teleportation. And that's probably right. I don't think anybody has seriously tested any technology that is even starting to show that this is even possible. And perhaps equally unsurprising is that the most expected form of transport to be here by 2030 would be the driverless car. I mean, we're reading about it in the press, as I said. Maybe what is surprising is there's still 49% of people who don't think it will be here. But we'll come on to that. Because one thing that is interesting is that a fifth, slightly over a fifth, don't believe there will be any change at all. Despite all of these tests happening, despite seeing all these things in development, there's still 1 in 5 people who are skeptical about whether these will really be here. And maybe that's not surprising. The way we research travel, the way we book travel, has changed dramatically over the last 20 years to be now all about digital and all about online. But the way we're actually traveling today is pretty much the same as it was when our grandparents travelled. Interestingly, when you look at it by nation, the Germans are a little more sceptical, with 27% thinking there'll be no change. And the French say no. 29% don't think there'll be any change. And again, there was a big generational difference. Millennials, only 13% didn't think there'd be any change, whereas for the over 65s, over a third, 33% plus, thought there would be no change in the way we travel. So to that question about trust, are people going to trust these forms of transport? Well, first of all, we deep dived into the driverless technology. And what we found was that only 25% of people would trust getting on board a pilotless vehicle or driverless car. About 38% would be uneasy about it. And most alarming of all, for those trying to promote these types of transport, 37% would be completely unwilling to get on board a driverless vehicle or a pilotless drone. So what's alarming for those people that are developing these types of technologies, if you add these two together, that's 75%. 3 in 4 people are either uneasy or unwilling to get on board with these types of transport. And if you break down that 37%, again, there is this shift between the generations. While 37% are unwilling to do it, it's only 25% for the millennials. Whereas the older generation, more than half would be unwilling to get on board driverless vehicles. So the challenge for those people promoting these types of technologies is how to convince that older generation to get on board. It also changes by gender, with men being slightly less skeptical of driverless technology, women being slightly more skeptical, and actually again by nationality, the Spanish are a lot less skeptical, and the Germans are more skeptical than the average. And the Germans at 42% are the most skeptical about getting on board a driverless car. Maybe the concept of bombing down an autobahn at 200 miles an hour without there even being a driver is what's scaring the Germans into not wanting to get on board. We also asked the audience about the future of flying. What was it that they wanted when it came to future technology changing the way we fly? Interesting, the most popular answer was that people are increasingly aware and conscious of the impact that going on holiday and taking these long flights is having on the environment. 32% saying that they wanted to fly in greener vehicles. Nearly the same amount, the next most popular result was that people want to get there faster. 31% saying that supersonic flight was the most important thing to them for the future of flying. Again, interestingly, there was a difference based on gender. Men, much more keen on supersonic flights, less bothered about it being green. Women having a strong preference, actually 15 percentage points preference towards greener energy. I'm not going to make mass generalizations about gender. I'm just telling you the stats. Now, one of the things that there was consensus was that people believe that these new forms of transport are going to be more comfortable, more luxurious. But there's a downside to that. Roughly the same amount, 4 in 5, believe that these new forms of transport will only be for the wealthy. Now, that's a claim that Rob Lloyd, CEO of Virgin Hyperloop, one of the other companies in the space to Dirk's, has refuted this and says that travelling by Hyperloop will be 2/3 the cost of a standard rail fare, and you'll get there 3 times as fast. If you travel on Virgin trains in the UK, it's about £200 to get from Manchester to London, so actually he's got quite a lot of room there to make it cheaper. But on the other side, then you've got things like Virgin Galactic, where they're charging $250,000 for one seat that will last just a few minutes. So, are people going to be willing to pay? Actually, the feedback was pretty strong, that 4 in 5, 80%, would not be willing to pay any more. They want to pay the same or less to change and switch to these newer forms of transport. And when we asked people to compare it to what they're currently paying for a long-haul flight to go on holiday, were they willing to pay much more, £500 per person? Only 4% of the people responding in our survey said they'd be willing to pay much more. The balance, 16%, would be willing to pay around £250 extra per person. So the challenge for the industry is how are they going to be able to meet all these infrastructure costs while not charging consumers any more for the privilege of travelling with them. There was a slight variation in willingness to pay more. When you look at supersonic flights, getting from A to B in half the time, then yes, around 43% of people were willing to pay a little more or much more. And they were also willing to pay, not quite as much, about 34% of people were willing to pay a little more or much more in order to travel via Hyperloop. What they weren't willing to pay for is to travel in a pilotless drone. Maybe the perception's there that, well, if you're not going to pay for a pilot, then I'm not going to pay as much for getting in the thing. And actually, the one result where people were expecting to pay neither more nor less was to travel on greener fueled vehicles. There's just this expectation that the industry needs to be moving into these technologies, but they don't think that they'll either make a saving or have to pay a premium in order to travel in those kinds of vehicles. And if there is only a small percentage of people willing to pay that premium to fly supersonic, we've had a pretty good case study. It costs about 30% more for Concorde to build and maintain than it did a 747. But actually, at its peak, Concorde was generating some reasonable profits. So we know that even that smaller number of people willing to pay for that premium kind of supersonic service can generate profits for the airlines that will embrace them. So maybe that it is these more high-end aspirational forms of transport that will then drive adoption, help bring down the costs, and make it more available and more appealing to the masses. There was a pretty universal response in terms of what people thought the benefits would be of these new forms of transport. Nearly 9 in 10 thinking that these forms of transport would get them there quicker. And actually 2/3 saying they think these new forms of transport are going to be less stressful, they will ease congestion and make travelling more appealing. And maybe that's a good news story for the industry. If we're going to try and move more people to more places around the world, we're going to need to do it in a less stressful and more convenient way. And is it going to get less congested? Well, and I checked these numbers with Dirk on the way out, Hyperloops are forecast to move 164,000 passengers per day. And then I compared that to, well, the Eurotunnel is transferring around 57,000 passengers and freight every day, and the most popular point-to-point routes in Europe also move around 55,000 passengers a day. So clearly, if the Hyperloop does work and can migrate some people onto this new form of transport, there's also a lot of headroom for that increase in volume in passengers that it's going to be able to accommodate. So again, the benefits were perceived to be that it was going to be eco-friendly. And of that, they think it's going to come through reduced emissions and a reduced reliance on natural resources. And that's not only because there's this consumer sentiment and understanding about the damage that travelling is doing to the environment, it's actually a good news story for the airlines as well. So they're not just in it for the consumers. The research that's being done at the moment by Air New Zealand, by Virgin Atlantic, and by Continental into greener fuels is forecasting there may be potentially savings of up to 80% on their fuel costs. And fuel is a massive part, as you probably all know, of an airline's cost. It's around $150 billion a year, according to IATA, of an overall cost of running the airlines of $750 billion. So it's about 1/6 of the costs. So if they can save that 80% on the fuel, not only doing the environment good, they'll maybe be able to provide that flight cheaper and still make some more margin on it as well. Now, obviously, there's an environmental question over the damage potentially that creating these green fuels creates that will need to be answered. So the challenge to the industry, to the travel industry, bringing these new forms of transport on board is actually very similar to the challenge that was faced over 200 years ago with the advent of rail and of steam. It's about overcoming fear. It's about building trust with the consumer. It's about making it safer, making it cheaper, making it more convenient, and making it greener. So we have a few recommendations, having been through all the results and done some research ourselves. We think in order to build consumer trust, one thing, particularly for things like pilotless drones, where there clearly is this gap between people being willing to get on board with it, is that maybe if they use pilotless drones for medical deployments, maybe rescuing people off the side of a mountain or from the sea in a pilotless drone, or transporting someone who's critically ill from where they fall ill to the hospital safely and in a shorter space of time, then people will start to build trust in this as a form of transportation. Also, familiarity breeds trust. The more of these driverless cars that are out on the road, that people see people safely getting on and off and travelling around, the more accident-free and the more common these cars are, then the quicker adoption will be. And I want to draw an analogy to the airline industry. I mean, when commercial flights first started, a lot of people were scared about going up on a plane, right? In fact, there's still people today who don't like flying. And one thing that the airline industry has actually done a very good job of is consistently putting out the message that flying is the safest form of travel. In fact, this story was from last year. In 2017, it was the safest year in airline history. There wasn't a single fatality on a commercial flight anywhere in the world. So it's that kind of messaging that people are going to need to hear from these people providing new technologies and driverless vehicles in particular. So the companies behind them are going to have to invest not just in technology, but in ensuring that these forms of transport are absolutely safe and they deliver safer track records, and then they invest in communication to the masses to make sure people believe it and understand it and are on board with it. Finally, it's always about the money. They have to make sure that the cost that they're going to charge consumers is no more than they're currently paying for the existing forms of transport. So I'm going to end on another quote, this one: "A rocket will never be able to leave the Earth's atmosphere." That was a headline in the New York Times in 1936. And yet, less than 20 years later, Yuri Gagarin looked down upon the Earth from space, from Sputnik. Now, what I'm excited about is I believe not only are these new technologies already here and coming on board faster than ever before. This revolution, this third revolution, may have taken its time coming, but it's now coming at speed. But more importantly, I think consumer adoption will be the fastest that it's ever been. I don't know how many of you saw an infographic floating around last year. I saw a couple of people put it in presentations, so I haven't included it here. But it was around how long it took for adoption to reach 50 million users, right? The telephone was something like 75 years. The radio was 38 years. The internet took just 4 years to reach 50 million users. Pokemon Go, 19 days. So in this world where the younger generation are the ones that are trusting these technologies, are getting on board with these technologies, but also in this world where Instagramming everywhere you go, sharing your travels, sharing your journeys with everyone, and not just social media, but the mainstream media, communicating these new forms of transport right across the world in seconds, I believe will mean that the adoption rates for these technologies will be incredibly fast. I'm excited about it. I hope you're excited about it too. And I'll tweet the full results if you're interested in hearing them. But with that, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Joel.
Sit down.
So, so as Joel converted you all into experts of future traveling and traffic, so there are 2 questions left to see what you learned. No, it's a joke. So maybe as you are experts in tourism, it's especially for you. And the first question will be, so I have to read it. How beneficial are innovative means of transportation for tourism? So for all of you experts, the first answer would be very beneficial. They make traveling easier. The second, they only have a small impact on tourism. Or third, not beneficial. They are traveling. They make traveling more expensive. So please put your bottom 1, 2, or 3 within the next 10 seconds. Oh, 81.6%. So that are good perspectives for the tourism. I think you are all very into new technology to make traveling easier and maybe cheaper too. Only 3.2% 82% think that it makes traveling more expensive. Hope you will be right in the year 2030. Thank you very much. And the second and last question is, what should the tourism industry do now? First, nothing right now. When the new means of transport are here, we'll see. The second one is, we should keep an eye on the developments and take action in due time. Or the third answer could be, we should actively drive developments and implement pilot projects. So please vote with your bottoms 1, 2, or 3 within 10 seconds, please. Oh. So this seems to be a very active audience here. So tourist managers, so we should actively drive developments and implement pilot project. That seems that the future is near, and that you learned very much from Joel. I think it was not only a test, but to see how the people think about the future things to come. Thank you very much for this, and so now we have a break of I think 15 minutes now. So thank you.